In May of 1972, on a 160-acre Wilson County, Tennessee dairy and corn farm on the Coles Ferry Pike east of Mount Juliet, a 24-year-old single woman named Reba Tinsley stood at the angled oak plank door of her grandfather Booker's 1919 hand-laid mortared fieldstone storm cellar at 5:50 in the morning, 2 years and 2 months after her father Bedford's March 1970 sudden heart attack at the silage wagon, with a yellow legal pad balanced on one knee, a square framing carpenter's pencil behind her ear, and a hand-drawn reinforced concrete roof restoration sketch unfolded across the oak plank door. She was lean and strong, sturdy in the shoulders and through the forearms, with the sun and wind-weathered skin of a young woman who had been milking 32 Jersey and Holstein cows twice a day since she was 9. She wore a faded chambray pearl snap work shirt under faded dark blue Carhartt-style denim bib overalls, scuffed russet leather lace-up work boots, and a heavy brown canvas chore coat against the cool May dawn. A faded navy ball cap was pulled low over a brown braid. A pair of buckskin work gloves was folded into her back pocket. Her hands were already calloused at 24, knuckles broad, palms thick at the heel where the milking stool handle had ridden for 15 years. The cellar in front of her had been hand-dug and hand-built by her grandfather Booker Tinsley in the spring of 1919. Booker had been born in 1887 on an East Tennessee Appalachian smallholding in Carter County and had immigrated to Wilson County in 1899 at age 12 with his parents, walking part of the way beside the wagon. He had bought the 160-acre Middle Tennessee dairy and corn place on the Coles Ferry Pike in 1918 for $2,800 cash, all of it earned over 19 years of hired labor. In the spring of 1919, almost 2 years after the May 7th, 1917 tornado outbreak that crossed Middle Tennessee and killed 79 people, Booker had set out 20 paces east of the back porch of the 1907 two-story white clapboard farmhouse, drawn a 14-foot square in the moory silt loam with a sharpened oak stake, and begun to dig. He had gone down 12 feet by hand, hauling each bucket of clay up by rope and pulley. He had quarried fieldstone out of the limestone shelves along the Stoner Creek bottoms and hauled it in by mule wagon. He had laid the walls 18 inches thick in his own mortar mix. He had set a flagstone floor by hand. He had roofed it with green oak rafters and rolled tin and built a single oak plank door at a 35-degree angle and hung it on hand-forged iron strap hinges. When he was done, the cellar measured 14 feet wide by 14 feet long by 10 feet tall on the interior, and it would stand exactly as he had built it for 49 years. Booker had died in October of 1968 at the age of 81. The funeral had been at the Mount Juliet Methodist Church on a Saturday afternoon with the casket open and Booker's broad, calloused hands folded across his chest. Reba had been 20 at the time. She had stood at the head of the receiving line with Bedford and Goldie and watched 4 counties' worth of dairymen file past, old men who had hired Booker out as a boy, neighbors who had stood with him during the 1937 flood, Mount Juliet storekeepers who had carried his account for 50 years. She had heard one of them tell Bedford at the door, "Your daddy built the only cellar between here and the river that ever held a family through a real one. You take care of it." Bedford had nodded once and said, "I will." Bedford Tinsley, Booker's only son and Reba's father, had died on March 17, 1970, at the age of 52, struck down by a sudden heart attack while loading silage onto a wagon 200 yards from the cellar his father had built. Reba was 22 when Bedford fell. By the spring of 1972, she had carried the operation alone for 2 years and 2 months. 32 milking cows, 48 acres of corn and soybeans rotation, 14 acres of alfalfa and orchard grass hay, an apple and pear orchard, a kitchen garden, a 1922 wood frame and tin dairy barn, a 1956 milking parlor, 2 1930 corn cribs, a 1928 grain granary, and a 1947 wood frame and tin tobacco barn, with her mother Goldie keeping the canning kitchen and the books inside the 1907 farmhouse, and her younger brother Hoyt, 18, helping Saturday afternoons through Sunday evenings when he was home from Cumberland College in Lebanon. On that May morning in 1972, the cellar needed work. The original 1919 oak and tin roof had begun to leak through the winter. The south wall mortar had begun to spall where groundwater had wicked in. A 4-foot section of the flagstone floor along the south wall had rotted underneath and was settling. Reba ran her gloved hand along the spalling mortar joint, looked at the sketch on the door, and said quietly to no one but herself, "All right then, concrete roof, repoint the south wall, new floor section, new door, vent pipe, bench, radio. That's what gets done this summer." Booker Tinsley had not come to Wilson County by accident. The Carter County small holding he had left behind in 1899 had been 43 acres of stony ridge ground above the Watauga River, terraced by hand by his own father and grandfather. The family had run 6 head of cattle, a half-acre tobacco patch, and a kitchen garden. The 1898 crop had failed under a 6-week drought and a late September hailstorm, and Booker's father had decided in the winter that the family would walk west to Middle Tennessee, where the bottom ground was deep and the rainfall was steady. They arrived in Wilson County in March of 1899 with 2 mules, 1 wagon, $400, and the clothes they wore. For 19 years Booker hired out, first as a barn hand, then as a milking man, then as a tenant on a 240-acre dairy place south of Lebanon. He saved every dollar he could. He married a Lebanon schoolteacher named Cordy Boatwright in 1909, and Bedford was born in 1918, the year Booker finally had enough cash to buy his own ground. He paid $2,800 in folded bills for the Coles Ferry Pike place and signed the deed at the Wilson County Courthouse on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 1918. The 1907 2-story white clapboard farmhouse came with the deed. So did a single-crib log barn, a smokehouse, and a hand-dug shallow well. The cellar came after the storm. On May 7, 1917, a year before Booker bought the place, an outbreak of tornadoes had crossed Middle Tennessee from the southwest and killed 79 people across 5 counties. Booker, still tenanting south of Lebanon at the time, had ridden out the storm in a root cellar dug into a hillside behind his rented house. The next morning he had walked 4 miles through scattered timber and dead livestock and seen a tenant family of 7 dead beneath a flattened wood frame house with no cellar. He never forgot it. When he closed on his own ground in March of 1918, the first improvement he marked on a piece of brown paper was a storm cellar. He began digging in the spring of 1919 and finished it that fall. Between 1919 and 1968, the Tinsley family used Booker's cellar during 11 separate tornado warnings. The first was in April of 1923, when Booker and Cordy carried Bedford, then 5, down the angled oak door at 3 in the morning. The last with Booker alive was in March of 1968, when an 80-year-old booker walked his great-niece down the steps in a slow, steady line. Bedford, who had grown up climbing in and out of the cellar with his father, took over the seasonal maintenance the spring he turned 18 in 1936 and held it through every spring of his life. He repointed sections of the south wall in 1942 and again in 1958. He replaced 2 flagstone slabs in 1951. He oiled the iron strap hinges every March. He kept a kerosene lantern, a tin canteen, and a wool blanket on the bench inside. Booker died in his sleep on October 9, 1968, 81 years old, in the upstairs back bedroom of the 1907 farmhouse. The cellar was used twice more after his death, once in May of 1969 during a Wilson County warning, once in March of 1970 during a watch that did not produce a touchdown. Bedford locked the door for the last time on the morning of March 17, 1970, walked out to the silage wagon, climbed onto the loading rim with a pitchfork, and fell at 52 of a coronary that the Lebanon doctor later said had been 30 years in the making. He was buried 5 days later in the Mount Juliet Cemetery beside his mother and father. Reba was 22 that spring. She had grown up in the cellar drills, had carried her own folded wool blanket down those steps since she was 4, had been taught by Bedford how to mix mortar at 9 and how to repoint a fieldstone joint at 12. In the 2 years after Bedford's death, she ran the dairy alone with Goldie, kept the corn rotation on schedule, sold milk through the Lebanon Co-op every other Tuesday, and let the cellar sit 1 season too long. The leaking roof, the spalling mortar, and the settling floor had been on her list since November of 1971. In May of 1972, she finally walked out at 5:50 in the morning with the legal pad and the pencil and made her plan. Wilson County in May of 1972 was a place where most farms had already begun to abandon traditional storm shelters. The new wood-frame ranch houses going up along the Coles Ferry Pike had hand-poured concrete basements. The new reinforced cinder block tornado-safe rooms being marketed by Lebanon contractors were sold as professionally engineered. The talk at the Tuesday cattle sale in Lebanon, when storms came up, was about basements and safe rooms. Almost no one was repointing a 1919 hand-dug fieldstone cellar. Reese Pickering, 51, was the Wilson County agent for the University of Tennessee Cooperative Extension Service Dairy and Crop Program. He had been at the Lebanon Extension Office since 1953. He drove a 1971 Ford pickup with a state of Tennessee seal on the door, and he stopped at the Tinsley place the 3rd Wednesday of every month to check on the milk quality readings and the corn stand counts. On the 3rd Wednesday of May, 1972, he stood in the side yard with Reba in the morning sun and looked at her drawing of the planned reinforced concrete and rebar slab roof. "Reba, you've got a strong head for figures and a good hand at the milking parlor. And your daddy and granddaddy were good men, both of them," he said. "But this is Civil War era thinking. Hand-dug fieldstone, 8 inches of concrete you're going to mix in a wheelbarrow. There are professionally engineered cinder block safe rooms a contractor in Lebanon will install for under $900. That's what the modern Wilson County dairy farm is putting in, not patching grandfather's cellar." Reba folded the drawing carefully. "Mr. Pickering, I appreciate the visit. I reckon I'll stay with the cellar." "Suit yourself," he said, "but it's outmoded." Hank Tarwater, 47, ran a commercial-scale Wilson County dairy operation 2 miles east of the Tinsley place. 240 head of Holsteins on 480 acres of Coles Ferry Pike bottom ground. He had built a 1968 ranch-style brick house with a hand-poured concrete basement and a 3-car attached garage. He stopped at the Tinsley mailbox in June of 1972 to drop off a borrowed wrench he had carried since Bedford's last spring, and saw Reba in the side yard with a wheelbarrow of broken oak rafters from the demolished 1919 roof. "You all are throwing good money at a hole in the ground," Hank said from the cab of his truck. "My basement under my house cost me $1,900, and it's all the storm protection any farm family needs. Anything underground hand-poured by a contractor will do you. You don't need stone." "My grandfather built it," Reba said. "I'm going to keep it." Hank shook his head once, said nothing else, and drove on. The centerpiece of the mockery came on a Friday afternoon in late June 1972, inside the First Citizens Bank of Lebanon, where Reba sat across from Glenn Sutherland, 49, the bank's agricultural loan officer. She had filed a written application 3 weeks before for a $750 farm improvement loan against the dairy operation. The application listed the cellar restoration as the use of funds. Glenn had her file open on the desk between them, a pencil tapping the edge. "Miss Tinsley," he said, "the bank's collateral appraiser places a hand-dug fieldstone cellar at 0 net contribution to a 160-acre dairy place. We can't extend a $750 farm improvement loan against an asset that doesn't exist on the county assessor's books. I'd recommend you reconsider. Pour a slab basement under a new garage instead. That at least adds resale value." Reba sat very straight in the chair. She had on the same chambray work shirt under a clean denim jacket, the navy ball cap on her knee. "I appreciate you looking at the file, Mr. Sutherland. I'll fund it out of pocket." "From last year's earnings?" "From the 1971 corn and the milk. Yes, sir. $387, give or take. $387, give or take." He closed the folder. "It's your money." "Yes, sir, it is." Buck Threlkeld, 54, the Wilson County field adjuster for the Farm Bureau Mutual Insurance Company of Tennessee, made his annual policy renewal site visit to the Tinsley place on a Tuesday morning in October of 1972, 3 days before the restoration was finished. He walked the farm with his clipboard, made notes on the dairy barn, the tobacco barn, the 1928 granary, the corn cribs, and the 1907 farmhouse, and stopped at the cellar last. He looked down the angled new oak door, looked at the new concrete cap above grade, and shook his head. "Reba, I'll renew the policy on the house and the barns at the standard rate," he said. "But I'm marking this cellar uninsurable. Underground structure of unknown construction history. Farm Bureau will not add cellar replacement coverage to a hand-dug fieldstone hole. Sign here, here, and here, and we're done for another year." She signed where he pointed. "Thank you, Mr. Threlkeld. Don't take it personal, it's policy." "I don't, sir." He left at 11:15, his pickup raising a low line of dust along the pike. Reba walked back to the cellar and ran her hand along the new oak door and the cool new concrete cap and went on with the work. The restoration itself had begun the second week of May 1972 and finished on October 11th. Reba kept a running tally in a small spiral notebook in her chore coat pocket, every bag of Portland cement, every length of rebar, every board foot of oak, every dollar paid in cash at the Lebanon lumber yard or the Mount Juliet hardware store. The first job, in the second week of May, was the demolition of the 1919 oak and tin roof. Reba climbed onto the cap with a crowbar and a claw hammer and pried each green oak rafter free in sequence, lowering them by rope to Hoyt on the ground. The rolled tin came off in sheets. By the end of 3 Saturdays, the roof was gone, and the open mouth of the cellar stared up at the sky for the first time since 1919. She covered it at night with 2 canvas tarps weighted with brick. The new reinforced concrete and rebar 8-inch slab roof went down across a single 18-hour Saturday and Sunday continuous pour the second weekend of June. Hoyt drove down from Cumberland College on Friday night with 4 roommates, 3 farm boys from Smith and DeKalb counties, and a Lebanon-born town boy who had never mixed concrete in his life. Reba had already laid the rebar grid on temporary plywood forms over the open cellar mouth, set in iron lifting hooks at 6 points, and built a screed board. The crew started at 4 in the morning on Saturday. 2 were on the mixer, 2 on the wheelbarrows, Hoyt on the screed, Reba on the float and the placement. They worked through the heat of the day, ate cold ham sandwiches Goldie carried out at noon and again at 6, switched off in pairs to nap on the back porch for 20 minutes at a stretch, and finished the last screed pass at 10 on Sunday night. Reba slept 11 hours on Monday and was back at the milking parlor at 4 Tuesday morning. The cure took 28 days. Through that month, Reba kept the slab wet, sprinkling it twice a day with a garden hose and laying damp burlap across the top. She used the cure month to do the wall repointing in July. With Hoyt home on Saturdays, she worked along the inside face of the 18-inch fieldstone walls, course by course, raking out the spalling 1919 mortar with a thin chisel, brushing the joints clean, and packing fresh Portland cement mortar in. The south wall, where the worst spalling had been, took 11 Saturdays. The east, north, and west walls took 5. By the end of July, the inside of the cellar smelled of new mortar and cool stone. August was the floor. The rotted south wall flagstone section, about 4 feet wide and 10 feet long, came up in fragments. Underneath, she found wet clay and one slow-seeping seam. She had a load of crushed limestone delivered to the side yard, hauled it in by wheelbarrow, tamped it down 2 inches at a time, set a layer of plastic sheeting, and hand-laid new bluestone slabs across the section. Each slab was set in a 1/2-inch bed of mortar and tapped level with a rubber mallet. She finished the bluestone on a Thursday evening, walked the cellar floor barefoot in the lantern light to check the level, and felt the whole 18 by 18-foot field run flat under her soles. September was the door. The original 1919 oak plank door had been rebuilt twice in Bedford's lifetime, once in 1948, once in 1962, and its third rebuild was overdue. Reba bought 4 8-inch thick, rough-sawn oak planks at the Lebanon lumber yard for $41 and had them milled square at the yard's planer. She built the new door on sawhorses in the shade of the apple orchard across 3 Sundays. She set the planks edge to edge, drilled and bolted 3 cross cleats of 2-inch oak, and pulled the whole thing tight. The hand-forged iron strapping, a 1/4 inch thick and 4 inches wide, came from a Mount Juliet blacksmith named McAfee, who had forged hinges and strap iron for Wilson County farms since the 1940s. He delivered the strapping in late September. Reba bolted it across the door face in 3 horizontal bands and along the 2 hinge edges. She and Hoyt hung the door together on a Sunday afternoon, working through 3 set and test cycles to get the angle right. When it swung shut for the first time, it sat down in its frame with a low, solid sound that did not echo. October was the finish work. The 4-inch galvanized steel ventilation pipe went up through a sleeve set in the new concrete roof. capped above grade with an oak and tin rain cap that Reba sawed and folded on the back porch workbench across 2 evenings. The hand-built oak bench seating for 14 came next. 3 benches, each 12 feet long, with shaped seats and braced legs, set along the north, east, and west walls. The hand-stitched first aid kit was a canvas roll Goldie sewed in the canning kitchen out of an old grain sack, packed with gauze, iodine, scissors, and a small pair of splints. The hand-stamped tin canteen, 3-gallon capacity, came from a Lebanon hardware store back shelf for $2.40. The Zenith transoceanic transistor radio was an honest splurge, $16.95 at the Sears catalog counter, packed with 2 spare 9-volt batteries and a small flashlight, set on a hand-built oak shelf above the east bench. On October 11th, 1972, at 4:15 in the afternoon, Reba pulled the heavy oak strap door shut from inside for the first finished close, turned on the Zenith, dialed in WLAC out of Nashville, sat for a moment on the new east bench with the new lantern at her elbow, and listened to a farm market report. Then she walked back up the steps, locked the door, walked to the back porch, and wrote in her spiral notebook. October 11th, 1972. Cellar done. Total, $387.04. The first cellar drill was on a Sunday afternoon in mid-November of 1972. Goldie came out of the canning kitchen with 2 of the 3 Hagood children. The Crockerill family of 4 walked over from a quarter-mile up the pike. The Vincent Reeves family of 3 came from the Stoner Creek crossroads. Reba ran them through a rapid shelter procedure. Who carries which child? Who unlatches the door? Who turns on the radio? Where each person sits on the benches. They timed it. From the back porch to a fully closed door was 3 minutes and 11 seconds. Reba wrote the time in her notebook and walked the families back across the pike at dusk. The seasons turned. Through the winter of 1972, the cellar sat dry and tight under a foot of snow. Reba walked down the steps once in late December and once in February with a flashlight and a thermometer, checking the interior temperature against the surface, making sure the 4-inch vent pipe was clear of ice. The cellar interior held 48 degrees through January, the slow, steady earth temperature of Wilson County Maury silt, loam 12 feet below grade. In the spring of 1973, Reba planted corn on the 48 acres of rotation ground in late April. She borrowed a 6-row planter from the Hagood place and ran it behind a 1962 Ford 4000 tractor that Bedford had bought used in 1968. The seed corn variety was a Pioneer 3369. A hybrid she had picked out at the Lebanon Co-op in February for $14.80 a bag. The planting took 9 working days across 2 weeks. Hoyt finished his freshman year at Cumberland College, came home full-time for the summer, and built the spring 1973 Finnish carpentry detail on the bench seating. Small backrests of oak slats, sanded smooth, attached with countersunk screws. He also built a second small oak shelf above the canteen for a kerosene lantern and a folded canvas tarp. The 1973 summer hay came off the 14 alfalfa and orchard grass acres in 4 cuttings. The first the second week of May, the second week of June, the third the second week of August, the fourth the first week of October. The hay was baled in square bales, 28 to 32 pounds each, stacked under the 1947 tobacco barn in tight rows. The 1973 autumn corn harvest brought in 4,872 bushels off the rotation ground at an average of 101 bushels per acre, a strong yield for Wilson County that year. Reba sold the corn through the Lebanon Co-op at $1.94 a bushel in late October and put $4,250 into the operating account after expenses. Through the 1973 to 74 winter, the dairy held steady at 32 cows, 18 Holsteins, 14 Jerseys, pulling an average of 41 pounds per cow per day, sold to the Lebanon Co-op for an average of $6.42 per hundredweight. Between November of 1972 and March of 1974, the Cellar was used in 8 false alarm tornado warnings. The first was on a January night in 1973 with 3 inches of standing snow on the cap. The Haygoods, Crockerells, and Vincent Reeveses all came over. The zenith stayed on for 2 hours. The all-clear came at 1:15 in the morning, and no tornado touched down in Wilson County that night. The second warning was in March of 1973, the third in April of 1973, the fourth in May of 1973, the fifth in November of 1973, the sixth in February of 1974, the seventh on a Sunday afternoon in March of 1974, and the eighth on the last Tuesday of March 1974. Each time Reba ran the procedure. Each time the radio stayed on. Each time the Cellar held. In the second week of March 1974, Reba did the routine annual maintenance. She walked the south wall with a flashlight, checking the new mortar joints. Everyone tight, everyone dry. She replaced the 2 9-volt batteries in the Zenith Transoceanic. She emptied, scrubbed, and refilled the hand-stamped tin canteen with 3 fresh gallons of well water. She oiled the hand-forged iron strap hinges on the door and the iron lifting hooks in the concrete roof. She added a folded wool army blanket to the east bench. She wrote it all down in the spiral notebook in her chore coat pocket and put the notebook back in the kitchen drawer. The morning of April 3rd, 1974, came in warm and humid across Wilson County. By 6 o'clock, the air over the Coles Ferry Pike was already in the low 60s. By 8, the southerly wind had picked up steady out of the south-southwest at 15 miles an hour. By mid-morning, the sky had taken on a yellow-gray color that Goldie remarked on from the back porch as she shook out a rag rug. "That sky doesn't look right," she said. "It looks like 1933. Reba was in the milking parlor at 5:30 in the morning, in the corn ground at 9, and back at the dairy barn for the noon check. At 4:30 in the afternoon, she came into the kitchen for coffee and turned on the Magnavox black and white television in the front parlor. The Nashville WSMV channel 4 weather broadcast was already in progress. The forecaster, in a narrow tie and a dark jacket, stood in front of a hand-drawn map. "We have elevated severe weather potential across all of Middle Tennessee this evening," he said. "An unusually strong frontal system is approaching from the west-southwest. Conditions are favorable for tornadic activity from late afternoon through midnight." Reba poured a second cup of coffee for Goldie, set it on the kitchen table, and said, "Mama, we're going to do the evening milking early. Be ready to move." The dairy barn evening milking began at 6:15, 15 minutes early. Reba and Hoyt worked side by side at the parlor. Hoyt had driven home from Lebanon at 4 for the weekend and finished the 32 cows by 7:20. The cows were turned out to the loafing pen behind the barn. Reba walked the cellar at 7:30, checked the door, checked the radio, checked the batteries, and walked back to the house. At 7:48, the zenith inside the cellar, which Reba had left on, broadcast the first National Weather Service Storm Prediction Center tornado watch for the 13-state warning area. Reba heard it from the back porch in the open evening air. She walked inside, picked up the kitchen wall phone, and started her first round of telephone calls to the immediate neighbor families. Hagood Place, Eldon speaking. Mr. Hagood, this is Reba Tinsley. We've got a tornado watch on the radio. Just want you all to be ready. If a warning comes through, come straight to the cellar. Don't wait. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Reba. She called the Crockerells next, then the Vincent Reeveses, then the Maynords, then the Threet place to the west, where Vester and Lillian, 78 and 76, kept a small kitchen garden and 3 laying hens. Each call took under a minute. Each ended with a yes, ma'am, or a yes, sir, and a quiet thank you. By 8:40, Reba had reached every household within a mile and a half of the Tinsley place. She sat at the kitchen table with Goldie and Hoyt at 9. Hoyt had the cellar key on a piece of jute twine around his neck. Goldie had her own coat folded over the back of her chair. The kitchen radio was tuned to WSM. At 9:28, the WSM announcer broke in over a song. A tornado warning has been issued for Wilson County and adjacent areas. Take shelter immediately. Repeat, tornado warning, Wilson County and adjacent areas. Take shelter immediately. The zenith down in the cellar carried the same warning 3 minutes later at 9:31. Reba was already moving. She crossed the back porch at 9:32, ran the 80 yards from the porch to the dairy barn to make sure the loafing pen gate was open so the cows could scatter, and ran back. At the back porch she said, "Mama, the radio, the canteen, the lantern, now." Goldie was on the phone again by 9:33, calling neighbors a second time. The Haygood family of 4, Eldon, his wife, and the 2 children, came up the pike in their pickup at 9:36. The Crockerell family of 4 arrived at 9:38. The Vincent Reeves family of 3 came in at 9:39. The Maynard family of 3 came in at 9:40. Vester and Lillian Threet came across the back field at 9:41, walking, Vester with his cane. At 9:41, Reba was at the pike with the headlights of her own pickup running, looking west down the road, when a 1965 Chevrolet pickup with 2 men in the bed pulled up and slowed. They were not Wilson County men. Reba had never seen either of them. They had a flat tire and no jack. They had been walking, and a passerby had given them a ride. The driver, a Stoner Creek Road farm hand named Eldon Maynard's cousin who had been waved on, was already gone. "Get in," Reba said. "Both of you, now, tornado." They climbed off the pickup bed and ran with her up the driveway. The 2 Stoner Creek Road hitchhikers came down the cellar steps at 9:42. At 9:42, the cellar held 19 people. Reba, Goldie, Eldon Haygood, his wife Marlene's substitute, let me restate. Eldon Haygood, his wife, and their 2 children, the 4 Crockerells, the 3 Vincent Reeveses, the 3 Maynards, Vester and Lillian Threet, and the 2 Stoner Creek Road hitchhikers. Reba counted heads twice and looked at Hoyt. Hoyt nodded once. Reba pulled the heavy oak strap door shut at 9:43 and dropped the iron bar across the inside latch. The siren from downtown Mount Juliet, 8 miles west, became audible at 9:45 as a low, thin wail through the 4 inches of galvanized ventilation pipe. The zenith was already on, tuned to WSM, the announcer's voice steady and tight. A 4-year-old Crockerell girl on the east bench began to cry. Goldie picked her up and held her in her lap and hummed a hymn very softly in her ear. At 9:47, the pressure in the cellar began to fall. Reba felt it first in her ears. She looked at the door and at the 4-inch vent pipe and at the new concrete roof 8 inches thick above their heads. "We're all right," she said quietly. "We're all right. Stay seated. Stay against the walls." At 9:48, the freight train roar of an approaching F4 tornado became audible through the ventilation pipe. It started as a low rumble and rose into a sound none of them had ever heard before. A sustained mechanical howl, neither thunder nor wind nor train, but all three together. The two Maynard boys, 6 and 8, sat with their backs against the new south wall fieldstone, eyes wide, mouths shut. Eldon Haygood put one hand on each of his children's shoulders. Vester Threet kept his cane across his knees and held Lillian's hand on the bench beside him. The Vincent Reeves family sat shoulder to shoulder. The two Stoner Creek Road hitchhikers, who had given their names as Curtis and a young man called Jonas, sat at the end of the west bench and did not speak. At 9:54, the F4 tornado, 3/4 of a mile wide at its widest and tracking ground for what would later be measured as 11 miles, crossed the Coles Ferry Pike directly over the Tinsley Place. The roar inside the cellar rose to a sustained pitch and held for 38 seconds. The 1922 wood frame and tin dairy barn, with its 1956 milking parlor inside, exploded across the corn ground in a single second. The 1947 wood frame and tin tobacco barn went next. The 1907 white clapboard farmhouse lost its roof at the second-floor plate line, and the entire second story was lifted off and carried east. The 1928 grain granary was scattered across 2 cornfields. The 2 1930 corn cribs were ripped open. The apple and pear orchard was stripped of leaves, and 3 of its 11 trees were uprooted. 2 miles east, at 9:55, the 1968 ranch-style modern brick house Hank Tarwater had built with the hand-poured concrete basement underneath it took the same F4 winds across its roofline. The roof lifted, the brick walls gave it the corners, the structural ridge beam fell, the basement ceiling collapsed under the weight of the brick and the ridge beam. Hank Tarwater, who had taken shelter in the basement at 9:40 with his wife and his 3 children, was killed when the falling ridge beam drove through the basement ceiling at the moment of collapse. His wife and 3 children, who had been sheltering at the opposite end of the basement near the west wall, were dug out alive 26 hours later by Wilson County volunteer firemen. All 3 children with broken arms and his wife with a fractured pelvis and a punctured lung. At 9:56, the F4 tornado passed east of the Tinsley Place. The roar through the vent pipe began to fall away. The pressure in the cellar began to equalize. The Zenith Transoceanic, which had stayed on through the entire passage, broke through the static with the WSM announcer's voice. "If you are in Wilson County, please remain in shelter. The tornado has passed east. Do not leave shelter until the all clear is issued." Inside the cellar, the 19 people sat very still. Goldie kept humming. The 4-year-old Crockerell girl had stopped crying and had gone quiet against Goldie's shoulder. Lillian Threet was praying in a low, steady voice. Eldon Haygood checked his children for any sign of injury, found none, and then began to weep silently with one hand across his face. Reba sat on the east bench between Hoyt and the wall and did not move. At 10:17, the WSM announcer issued the all clear for the Wilson County area. The Zenith carried it through clearly. Reba waited another 8 minutes. At 10:25, she stood, walked up the steps, lifted the iron bar off the inside latch, and pushed the heavy oak-strap door up against gravity. It swung open on the hand-forged hinges with the same low, solid sound it had made the day she hung it. She climbed up 2 steps and looked out. Where the dairy barn had stood, there was nothing but scattered timber across the corn ground. Where the tobacco barn had stood, there was a single corner post still upright. The 1907 farmhouse, 80 yards across the backyard, was missing its entire second story and the roof of the kitchen. The apple orchard was stripped to bare wood. The granary was gone. The corn cribs were splinters. 2 of the 32 dairy cows were dead in the loafing pen wreckage. The other 30 were standing in the cornfield with their heads down. The sky above was clearing, and the moon had come out behind tearing cloud. The cellar steps and the cellar cap above grade, and the new concrete roof and the 18-inch fieldstone walls were untouched. The hand-built solid oak door was untouched. The new hand-forged iron strapping was untouched. The 4-inch galvanized vent pipe still stood vertical with the oak and tin rain cap on top. Reba climbed the rest of the way out into the night and stood on the cap and called down through the open door, "All clear, come on up. Slow, careful of the rubble." The 19 of them came up one at a time. Goldie carried the 4-year-old Crockerell girl, whose right elbow had bumped the bench when the pressure first dropped and was bruising purple. It would be the only injury suffered by any of the 19. By 11 o'clock, the first Mount Juliet volunteer firemen had reached the Coles Ferry Pike. By 11:45, Reba and Hoyt had borrowed 2 flashlights and 2 shovels and started east up the pike toward the Tarwater farmstead. The Hagood, Crockerell, Vinson Reeves, Maynard, and Threet families stayed at the Tinsley back porch under Goldie's direction. The children wrapped in wool blankets, the Zenith carrying the steady stream of WSM bulletins. The 2 Stoner Creek Road hitchhikers stayed too and would help dig out the Tarwater basement at first light. April 4th, 1974, came on gray and cold. Frost lay across the wreckage. Reba and Hoyt had not slept. The Coles Ferry Pike was a 4-mile line of destruction. Of the 16 farmsteads destroyed along the pike that night between Mount Juliet and Lebanon, 8 homes were down, 4 sets of dairy barns were down, and the Tarwater Operations 1968 ranch-style brick house was at the bottom of its own basement. 6 Wilson County residents had been killed. 31 were hospitalized. Reba and Hoyt and the 2 Stoner Creek Road hitchhikers and 3 Mount Juliet volunteer firemen worked at the Tarwater basement until 10 in the morning, lifting brick and broken joists 1 piece at a time until they reached Hank's wife and the 3 children at the west wall. They lifted Mrs. Tarwater out first on a door leaf used as a stretcher. The children came up one at a time. Hank's body was recovered at 2 in the afternoon by a separate crew. The Hagood family went home to a destroyed wood frame ranch with a hand-poured concrete basement crushed under its own first-floor joists. The Crockerell house was off its foundation. The Vinson Reeves place was gone. The Maynard place was gone. The Threet farmstead, next west, had lost its barn, but not the small frame house. All 5 of those families understood by mid-morning of April 4th that they would not have survived in their own basements. Eldon Haygood walked back across the Tinsley yard at noon, found Reba sitting on the kitchen steps with a cup of coffee, and stood without speaking for a long moment. "Reba," he finally said, "if you hadn't called us, if we'd stayed in our basement, you'd have done the same for mine, Eldon." "No, ma'am. I'd have built a basement." She nodded and drank the coffee. On April 5, 1974, the Wilson County Civil Defense Office sent a man named Harlow McGeehee out to the Tinsley place to inspect the cellar. He spent 2 hours measuring, photographing, and writing on a clipboard. He climbed down the steps, ran a hand along the 18-inch fieldstone walls and the new concrete roof, looked up at the 4-inch galvanized vent, and climbed back up. He stood with Reba at the cellar cap and shook her hand for a long time. "Miss Tinsley," he said, "we'd like to designate this an official Wilson County Civil Defense tornado shelter, effective this autumn. There'll be a metal sign on a post by the driveway, and the county will list this address in the next civil defense pamphlet as a community shelter for Coles Ferry Pike. I'd be honored, Mr. McGeehee. It saved 19 lives, ma'am. It saved them because my grandfather Booker built it in 1919. He nodded slowly and put the clipboard under his arm. The Lebanon Democrat ran the story on the front page of the April 11th, 1974 edition under the headline, Fieldstone Cellar Shelters, 19 as F4 crosses Pike. The article ran 19 column inches with 2 photographs, one of the surviving cellar cap with the new oak door propped open, one of Reba standing beside the dairy barn wreckage in her chore coat and ball cap. The article quoted Eldon Haygood, Vester Threet, and the Crockerell father. It did not quote Reba directly. The reporter had asked her 3 questions on the back porch the morning of April 6th, and she had answered each one in 2 or 3 sentences, and then walked back to the milking parlor to check on the surviving 30 cows. Reese Pickering of the UT Extension Office stopped by the Tinsley place on the 3rd Wednesday of April, 1974, his usual visit. He stood at the cellar cap in the morning sun with his hat in his hand and did not say anything for a long time. "Reba," he finally said, "I owe you an apology. I was wrong about this cellar. I'd like to take a set of measurements and write up a construction summary for the Extension Service. There may be other Wilson County farms that ought to know how this was built. Take all the measurements you want, Mr. Pickering." "Thank you, ma'am." Glenn Sutherland of the First Citizens Bank of Lebanon sent a personal letter dated April 18th, 1974, on bank letterhead. It was 3 paragraphs long. The 3rd paragraph read, "If you should ever wish to expand the dairy operation or invest further in farm infrastructure, the bank will reconsider its prior position on collateral value of historical Wilson County storm shelters. I regret the June 1972 loan denial. Yours sincerely, Glenn Sutherland." Reba read the letter once at the kitchen table, folded it back into its envelope, and put it in the kitchen drawer beside the spiral notebook. Buck Threlkeld of the Farm Bureau Mutual Insurance Company came in person on April 22, 1974, with a revised policy schedule. He sat at the kitchen table with Goldie's coffee in front of him. "Reba, the company will now insure the cellar at replacement value. No underwriting questions, no exclusion. We've reviewed the case. I was wrong. Sign here." "Yes, sir." "And, ma'am, I'm sorry about your barns." "Thank you, Mr. Threlkeld." By the autumn of 1974, the Wilson County Civil Defense Office had designated the Tinsley Stone Storm Cellar an official Wilson County Civil Defense tornado shelter. The metal sign went up on a 4x4 oak post at the head of the driveway in October. White letters on a green background, Civil Defense Tornado Shelter, with an arrow pointing east toward the cellar. The Tinsleys spent the summer of 1974 rebuilding. The dairy barn went back up on its old foundation as a steel frame and corrugated tin structure with a rebuilt milking parlor. The tobacco barn was rebuilt smaller. The 1907 farmhouse was re-roofed, and its second story was rebuilt within the old footprint by a Mount Juliet carpenter named Curtis Threet, Vester's nephew, Caldwell's father, over the summer and fall. By 1976, 14 Wilson County families had built or restored stone and concrete storm cellars on the Booker-Tinsley 1919 model. 6 were new builds. 8 were restorations of pre-1940 hand-dug cellars that had been allowed to go to ruin in the modern basement era. Reba walked through every one of them at the family's invitation, measuring with a folding rule, checking the wall thickness and the roof slope, and signing off in pencil on a hand-drawn farm sketch the owner kept folded in a kitchen drawer. The cost of a new build by 1976 ranged from $620 for a small 8x10 family cellar to $1,140 for a 14x16 community cellar capable of sheltering 25. Every one of them used 18-inch fieldstone walls or 12-inch hand-poured concrete walls, an 8-inch reinforced concrete roof, a solid oak strap-hinged door, a 4-inch galvanized vent pipe, and a battery-powered weather radio on a hand-built shelf. In the spring of 1977, the University of Tennessee Cooperative Extension Service launched a free annual one-day continuing education clinic on traditional Middle Tennessee stone and concrete storm cellar construction. The clinic was taught at the Tinsley Place every March by Reba and Hoyt, with Reese Pickering handling the registration and the printed handouts. The first clinic in March 1977 had 19 attendees. The second in March 1978 had 34. By the spring of 1985, the clinic was capped at 60. The format was steady from the first year forward: a morning lecture under the apple and pear orchard with a mimeographed handout, a midday demonstration at the actual cellar of mortar mixing and joint packing technique, a Goldie cooked midday meal of pinto beans and cornbread served on long planks set on sawhorses, and an afternoon walk-around with hand-drawn site sketches for each attendee's farm. By the late 1970s, the clinic was drawing attendees from as far away as Marshall and Bedford counties to the south, and from Sumner and Macon counties to the north. Reese Pickering held the registration list in a black binder with a hand-typed index card for every farm. He kept that binder until he retired, and then handed it to Andrew McAfee at the spring 1986 clinic. In June of 1981, Reba married Caldwell Threet, a Lebanon, Tennessee large animal veterinarian and a grandnephew of Vester Threet, who had been one of the elderly retired couple sheltered in her cellar on the night of April 3, 1974. Caldwell had begun his veterinary practice in Lebanon in 1977 after graduating from the University of Tennessee College of Veterinary Medicine in Knoxville. He had been the calling vet on the Tinsley dairy operation since 1978. He proposed on a Sunday afternoon in March of 1981, sitting on the bench outside the storm cellar with Reba, who was 33 by then, and they were married in the Mount Juliet Methodist Church on a Saturday in June with Goldie and Vester and Lillian Threet in the front pew. They had 3 children: Beulah Jean, born 1983, a son named Booker, born 1985 after Reba's grandfather, and a younger daughter named Goldie Mae, born 1988. Through the 1980s and 1990s, the Tinsley operation continued. The dairy herd settled at 28 Jersey and Holsteins after Reba culled 4 older Holsteins in the autumn of 1982. The corn and soybeans rotation held at 48 acres. The alfalfa and orchard grass hay was cut 3 times a year. The cellar held through 6 more tornado warnings between 1974 and 1999, none of them touchdowns over the Tinsley Place, and was used by an average of 12 to 22 neighbors and travelers each time. Reba ran the spring clinic with Hoyt every March. Hoyt himself married a Lebanon schoolteacher named Wanda Crockerell in 1982. The youngest Crockerell daughter, who had been 7 years old on the night of April 3, 1974, started his own 40-acre place south of the Pike and never left Wilson County. He and Wanda had 2 children, both of whom learned to mix mortar at the spring clinics before they were 10. Goldie Tinsley died at the age of 78 in 1990 of a stroke at the kitchen table. Vester Threet had died in 1979 at 83. Lillian Threet had died in 1982 at 84. Reese Pickering had retired from the UT Extension Service in 1986 and had handed the clinic registration off to a younger county agent named Andrew McAfee, the great-grandson of the Mount Juliet blacksmith who had hand-forged the cellar door strapping in 1972. Reese had attended every spring clinic in retirement until he died in 1998. In 2016, at the age of 68, Reba turned the operation over to her eldest daughter, Beulah Jean Tinsley Threet, who had returned home in 2010 with her own husband and 2 children after 11 years as a dairy and crops manager in Sumner County. The transition was formal, a written succession plan signed at the Lebanon Attorney's Office. The farm operating account moved to Beulah Jean's name, the spring clinic registration handed off, and the Wilson County Civil Defense Shelter designation transferred. The metal sign at the head of the driveway was repainted that summer. The new sign read the same words on a green background, with the same arrow. The original 1919 hand-laid 18-inch fieldstone walls and the 1972 reinforced concrete and rebar roof are still in place today. The hand-built solid oak door with the McAfee quarter-inch hand-forged iron strapping is on its 4th set of hinges. The 4-inch galvanized vent pipe was replaced once in 2003. The hand-built oak bench seating for 14 has been rebraced twice. The hand-stitched canvas first aid kit has been replaced 3 times. The hand-stamped tin canteen still sits on the east shelf. The Zenith transoceanic transistor radio has been replaced 4 times. The most recent in 2019 with a National Weather Service all-hazards weather radio with a battery backup, set on the same hand-built oak shelf where Reba placed the first Zenith on October 11, 1972. Reba Tinsley Threet is 76 years old in this spring of 2024. She still lives in the 1907 farmhouse with Caldwell, who is 74, retired from his Lebanon veterinary practice since 2018. She still walks down the cellar steps every March to check the south wall mortar and run a flashlight beam across the new concrete roof. She still keeps the spiral notebook in the kitchen drawer. She still teaches a half-hour segment at the spring clinic each year, the part on hand-mixing Portland cement mortar, and Beulah Jean teaches the rest. The 2024 spring clinic on the 2nd Saturday of March had 73 attendees from 11 Tennessee counties and 2 Kentucky counties, and the morning lecture under the apple and pear orchard included 3 grown men in their 50s whose parents had sheltered in Reba's cellar on April 3, 1974, and who had brought their own children to learn the mortar mix. The Wilson County Civil Defense Office last updated the official shelter pamphlet in the spring of 2023. The Tinsley place is still listed. The Coles Ferry Pike is paved now and runs busier than it did in 1974. The 480-acre tar water operation was sold in 1979 to a Lebanon investor, and the 1968 ranch-style brick house was never rebuilt. The basement was filled in with crushed limestone and seeded over to pasture. The 14 Wilson County families who built storm cellars on the Booker Tinsley 1919 model in the years between 1974 and 1976 still own and operate every one of them. In the kitchen drawer of the 1907 farmhouse, in the same spiral notebook where Reba once wrote, October 11th, 1972, cellar done, total $387.04. There is a final entry written in her hand at the bottom of the same page, dated April 4th, 1974. 19 people, all home, cellar held. If you have ever known an average farmer who did the work nobody noticed until it mattered, leave a comment below telling us about her. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe and ring the bell. There is an average farmer in every county in America. We are telling their stories one season at a time,